Privacy and security in the 21st century. Who knows and who controls forum. This is it's a very great pleasure for the Academy to have this very important forum for all of us, and since we're all concerned about these privacy and security issues very much. I welcome you all to this. This is really continuing on this theme of privacy and security that was initiated yesterday. And this forum really brings together a panel of experts to discuss new technologies being developed to secure computer devices and protect individuals and basically collective privacy. We have four distinguished panelists here today. We have, this is an alphabetical order, I think Batya Friedman. Batya, thank you very much. She's a professor in the Information School at the University of Washington. And Anshul Gupta, she's Director of Security. Give him a wave. Thanks very much, Anshul. At Facebook. And then Leah Kistner, the Global Lead of Privacy Technologies at Google. Leah, welcome. And then Mike Walker, you met yesterday, the Principal Researcher at Microsoft Research Next. All have extensive experiences in these sectors, and you can find their complete bios in today's program, as a matter of fact. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Ollie Velci, the anchor and business correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC, well-known journalist and frequent moderator of Academy panels, and our great friend. Thank you very much, Ollie.
My pleasure.
Ollie will provide these instructions about how this is going to go and how you're going to ask questions and all that sort of thing for this. And this program is being streamed and videotaped, as a matter of fact. So, with that, I will turn the panel over to you, Ollie, and you can go take it and go for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everybody. It's absolutely my pleasure and honor to be back with you. I have such remarkable respect for this organization and the work that you all do. You've heard me say, if you've been here before, that the sooner the world is run by engineers, the better it'll all be for us. And I mean that only somewhat sarcastically. We have grand challenges that do have to be solved, and as our political discourse ebbs and flows, sometimes what happens, and there are lots of problems with having poor political discourse, but one of them is that it squeezes out the conversations about the very solvable problems we have in the world that can be taken care of by people like you. So I worry about that. And one of the conversations we have here every year is the degree to which people like me in the media can benefit from interacting more with you, learning more from you, and figuring out ways to get that message out into the public. Unfortunately, we're in a moment where all of that sort of stuff is squeezed out from the mainstream media, but one day, hopefully, that will change. I appreciate being back here. You have a remarkable panel in front of you. Because you have so many questions, as you always do, we've left enough time for it, but let me just tell you how this is all going to go down. We will hear from our panelists. They've got presentations of a few minutes each, and they are particularly important because we're dealing with very specific issues today and understanding with clarity where their expertise lies and where they think the world is on issues of digital security and privacy is going to be important, because even for people like me who work on this journalistically, the distinctions about who knows what and who controls what, how security and privacy are distinct and yet dovetail at some points is going to be important, and that's going to allow you to interact with our panel more effectively. As you know, as a non-academic, I always ask that your questions are not theses. It is useful to know your section and sort of what area you are an expert at, and if there's background that's relative, but if you can, keep that fairly brief and keep your questions designed so that they can actually be answered. We will take a break for the restrooms, and I can see that while you've made some improvements, the ratio of men to women is still going to make the bathroom breaks an issue. So we're going to We're going to allow 15 minutes for bathroom breaks. I suspect it might take a little longer, but please try and keep it as tight as possible so that we can get back here. So certainly do what your body needs you to do, but not what your mouth needs you to do. You can chat later. On the topic, first of all, just to get a feeling for it, you see the sponsors up there. I suspect everybody's interacted with these companies. Just show of hands, how many of you deal with Amazon? Okay, good. How many of you do or have dealt with Microsoft products or services? Okay. How many of you deal with Google? Pretty good. And Facebook? Okay, slightly fewer. Slightly fewer, which is going to be interesting and instructive in our conversation, because for some people the issues of privacy and security are greater than others. For some people, what they share or the information they have in the cloud or on their devices is different, but this is an important discussion nonetheless. One of the things that I want to ask our panelists to, in the course of their conversations, touch on is the issue of who knows and who controls. My quick answer is that everybody but you and everybody but you. But that may not be accurate, may not be fair. The issue of security and privacy, the two in competition with each other if they are. The issue of security and privacy versus the convenience that this new digital world has given us. The issue of trust, which is not necessarily, I think, the first thing people thought about when they started to engage in a more fully digital world, although there was always a question of trust as it came to putting your credit card number on file. But I think there are a lot of people who thought that once we had that nailed, it was okay. And I don't think we realized this was going to get substantially more complicated for most of us. And I will ask, I will remind our panelists that while this is definitely one of the smartest crowds I ever engage with, I think they put journalists here once in a while just to remind us how little we know. Put you in front of a crowd that's just a lot smarter than you are. But for many of these people, they won't work in the area of expertise that you do. So if you can keep your comments as accessible as possible and your examples to illustrate what it is you're talking about as accessible as possible, so that our audience appreciates it and is able to benefit from it and can ask you really good questions. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with our panelists, their presentations. We'll have a little bit of a chat. We'll take a little bit of a break. And then basically it's all up to you. I will moderate your questions the way you do it. You see the two mics here. You line up there. I will alternate. We're going to keep it to one question per person. And again, just to try and get this to be as robust as possible, please think your question through and try and keep it relatively tight. I would ask, obviously this is for discussion, so there might be things you simply disagree with. Hopefully they're questions. If there are statements or disagreements, just try and keep them tight. I don't want to stifle any discussion here. I just want to make sure that we're actually able to discuss the things that you want to discuss. So with that, I'll take it over to Mike. You heard from Mike a bit yesterday, but in the context of this conversation, I'm going to take it over to Mike Walker with Microsoft. Mike?
So we started out at the beginning of the personal computer revolution with the forcing function of optimization. We had to get as much power into the hands of a consumer as possible and give them an incredibly powerful CPU, which was kind of a brand new thing at the dawn of the compute age, and do as much with it as possible. And there wasn't a lot of silicon real estate to dedicate to other functions like security, trust, and privacy. And we're going through right now a microarchitectural revolution in the devices that we carry around in our pocket, the devices we put on our desktop, where having connected computers to the internet and created kind of a global community of networked computers, we are seeing new forcing functions acting upon the design of those devices. And those forcing functions are starting to percolate change all the way down to the silicon. A modern devices that are in the pipeline, sometimes in your hands, or devices that are coming, contains a lot of silicon real estate, design properties that allow computers today to have trust, privacy, and proof mechanisms built in. So one of the, I think we have some slides that are going to play here. So some of these core properties begin with a hardware root of trust, kind of a unique set of key material that is burned into every device that is known to an outside actor and can be used to leverage remote trust in a small device. What that allows us to do is avoid kind of this total war between malware and the operating system, where when a virus compromises your desktop computer, it can gain the same privilege and ability as the administrator, and your only option is to reformat it and start over. With modern devices like heart rate monitors in cars, we cannot connect and reformat, and that means that that trusted ability to reinstall software, to look into the computer and see where the threats are, needs to remain isolated. And so what we have, enabled by that by the hardware root of trust, is a trusted compute base, a computer that remains aloof and is dedicated only to security and privacy, and it runs first, and it runs at the top of the stack. And there are a whole bunch of enabling technologies that are built on top of that trusted compute base, things like certificates to say that we're running the correct code that we believe in, online failure reporting, renewable security that comes from an always-on available computer, the cloud, dynamic compartments, boxes that we can put around code that we believe is less safe so that when that code is compromised, it doesn't affect the overall health of the device. And these are all very abstract properties, but one of the places where you've probably seen it in your life, one slide over, is in the iPhone. The iPhone is an example of radical technology transition. Can we advance the slide? The iPhone contains on its main processor an enclave that is dedicated to security and privacy. It's called the Secure Enclave. It is a chip within a chip, and its purpose is not to be a powerful processor, but to be a trusted processor. And its DNA is about trust all the way down. And that custom processor that holds secrets and only does operations on those secrets but will never reveal them is used to bootstrap tasks from fingerprint recognition to payment co-processing. And we have the ability, when there is a trusted compute base like the Secure Enclave, to connect that enclave directly to an always-on, always-available computer. One slide. The cloud. And what that allows us to do is to have remote proof that trusted things are happening within the enclave, even if we can't trust the entirety of the system. And that microarchitectural revolution of a custom subprocessor, trusted keys built into the hardware as a remote trust system that's connected all the way to the cloud, it's starting in $1,000 phones, but it is coming to even the most ubiquitous processors inside the Internet of Things. There's now generally available microcontrollers that contain very similar advances. And what we should come to expect out of computers is never to have those total failure moments when malware has the ability to compromise the entire device and we have to physically intervene, but that the ability to remotely diagnose, remotely learn about new threats, and remotely remediate them is going to be hardwired into the silicon and is going to happen from the vantage point of a globally distributed security system. And powering that globally distributed security system, as we scale to billions of devices, is going to be artificial intelligence. One slide. Artificial intelligence is still in its prototype stage in the security domain, but this machine, which was in this picture at the Smithsonian Museum of American History, is an artificial intelligence that can find, diagnose, and write the fix for brand new security flaws, not identified by human beings, but identified entirely by a machine. And that is the future that many technology companies are trying to bring into being, which is not just do we have the ability to peer into remote devices from a hardware root of trust, diagnose and fix security flaws at scale, but to have artificial intelligence be able to do it at the scale of billions of nodes very quickly through the power of the cloud.
Mike, thank you very much. We're going to pick up on some of those topics that you were discussing toward the end. I want to go to Leah Kistner of Google.
So we're here today to talk about security and privacy, but I want to pull that focus back a little bit, and I want to think about building products and building systems with respect. A secure system is one that's built in such a way that we know it does the thing that we say it's going to do. And frankly, nobody quite agrees on exactly what privacy means. Some people mean that no one's ever going to learn anything about me. And some people mean that I have a lot of control over who learns what and when. And there are some people who mean that I won't get intrusions. And people mean many, many, many different things. But the words that we use, I don't think are as important here as building systems that help people do the things that they want to do, and recognizing that different people have different needs and they have different desires, and building those human values into our systems. So the security things are necessary for respect, and the privacy things are necessary for respect, but there are other things as well. And it means we need to build systems so that humans can interact with each other well in a system, right? We've seen lots of places on the internet where people don't necessarily behave well towards each other. And there are places where we need to be careful about how humans interact with the system and build the system so that humans understand and can make good choices about that. It's really easy, for example, for privacy settings to become essentially the control panel from Apollo 11. And that's very, very hard for people to use effectively. And one of the things that I think about in there is, how do we build the system so that we can have these ways for humans to interact with it and ways for humans to feel comfortable with it? And that means making choices that, for example, where we use cryptography so that we can't see the data or other people can't see the data, or making choices that make the systems run more slowly, but they run in a way that is more understandable and predictable to humans. So we kind of try and think about that all the way down, all the way from humans down to the hardware. How do you architect a system like that? How do you design a system like that? And it takes a lot of different skill sets to do that. It takes user experience people. It takes people who understand how very large systems work. It takes philosophers and ethicists. It takes people like me. I'm actually a cryptographer. And we have to all kind of come together behind this goal.
Okay, lots that we need to unpack there, but we will do that once we're finished our discussion. Let's go to Anshul.
So I'm going to be talking about how do you manage security at scale. This is one question that I get asked a lot. We have 2.5 billion users on our platform. And people, the first thing that they ask me when they say, oh, so you are leading a security function at Facebook, how big is your team? Because that's what they are trying to associate with, like that must be a huge team. And I want to bring focus to, it's not about the size of the team that matters when you're trying to secure systems. There are a lot many other things that we need to focus on when we are scaling a security function. So I'll start by sharing a story. So this is a story about a company named Sand Corp. And as the name suggests, they used to manufacture sand, a lot of sand. And they were really good employers. So they had this perk for their employees that they can take as much sand as they liked home at the end of every day, no questions asked. With only one condition, they cannot smuggle anything in that sand. So to make sure nobody is smuggling anything, they deployed some security guards at every exit who will test the sand being taken home every evening to make sure everything is done right. So there was this one employee who would take a wheelbarrow full of sand at the end of every day. and the guards will do their due diligence. They would poke his sand, and they would not find anything. And it kept on happening day after day. And after like 20 years of service, this employee decided to retire. Now guards were like, oh my God, this guy took so much sand home, and today is his last day. If we don't ask him today what he did with this much sand, we might never know. So they gathered some courage, they approached this person, and they asked their question. This employee smiled, looked at them, and said, you are really diligent people, you were doing your job perfectly. Without fail, you were poking in my sand every day to make sure I'm not taking power tools or anything home hidden in that sand. But guess what? What was the person doing? He was taking a new wheelbarrow home every night. Yes. So we as security experts, sometimes we fail to look at the big picture. We are so focused on small little details that we forget what the attacker might be thinking, what they might be after. And we tend to protect things which don't need protection. And that's where I think we as security experts need to really focus our attention on. So when I think about Facebook's culture, things at Facebook move really fast. And if you go and talk to engineering and you say, before you ship anything, you will have to talk to security people for some manual reviews, it's adding friction. They'll be like, we are shipping continuously. It's CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. You just cannot have these manual reviews. So what do you do in those circumstances? I put these things like, what do you do in 3 big categories. One is, what are the automated technical solutions you can build? Second is building some lightweight processes. And the third one is developing security programs. So I'll touch upon these briefly, and we can have more discussion about this during our panel. So when I say building some technical solutions, I think about empowering your users, your engineers, and security community. A lot of times people focus on just one slice of it. They will either try to empower their engineers or users. I say we need to empower all 3. By empowering your engineers, I mean you need to give them tools where they don't have to think about security day in, day out. For example, if you are going to tell your engineers that you all need to become crypto experts, and you need to know which encryption to use when, which hashing algorithm to use, and what's the right way to use it, you are taking those cycles away from them where they can be focused on their business logic. So give them your underlying, build underlying libraries for them. Provide them infrastructure so they don't have to worry about it. They can just write their code on that underlying infrastructure. Empowering users, giving them tools like 2-factor authentication, login alerts. These are some examples of how you can empower your users to have more secure accounts. Then security community. This is where I think Google, Microsoft, Facebook, we tend to definitely play some part by sharing what we have built internally with our external community. Like couple of examples is OS Query. I don't know if you have heard of this tool. This is the endpoint security tool where you can get all the endpoint notifications from your client devices in a relational database form. Pyre is another static code analysis tool for Python. So these are some examples that we can use to empower our users, engineers, and community. Lightweight processes, they also definitely play a very important role. I'm not saying we should not do manual reviews. We should, because that's what shows us that big picture. Poking in the sand every day is not going to get you where you want to go. There is a lot of traffic we get on our network, and it is anomaly detection that is very important. It is knowing which traffic you should be looking at, like where is the user data. That's what you are protecting most of the time. So knowing those things is very important. So doing threat modeling and these activities come into that area. And the last one, security programs. So these are the programs you build for the larger security community. Could be outside your organization or could be inside. So when I say outside, it could be like threat exchange. I don't know if you have heard about this, but threat exchange is a platform that Facebook built. So we once had an incident where we were working very closely with partners on both sides, Microsoft and Google. We were trying to figure out some attacker in our network, and we had a very close partnership. At that time, the way we were sharing IOCs, indicators of compromise, was in a very organic fashion, like emails, Dropbox, O365, SharePoint. Everything goes. And soon we realized we were all very lost. So that's when this idea of threat exchange was born, where in a very organized fashion, you can share your indicators of compromise. Now we have more than 700 companies on this platform sharing what they see in their own network. So they can collaborate. And that makes us a better security community. So I have a few more examples, but I think in the interest of time, I will stop here.
Well, yeah, we'll get to all of them. Thank you for that.
Yes. Thank you.
Matya, let's have you wrap this all up.
Thank you. So I think I'll just make 5 observations to add to the collection of ideas that are being put forth here. The first observation would pertain to just what this meaning of privacy is about. And in fact, most of the time, I think at this meeting and in many other meetings, we're talking about privacy in terms of control of data and flow of information. But what I'd like to do is actually turn the clock back to 1890, December 15th, when Warren and Brandeis published their paper in the Harvard Educational Review on the right to privacy. Now, this is widely regarded as the first publication in the United States to advocate for a right to privacy. And in their articulation, that right was primarily as a right to be let alone. So just the idea that you could be your inviolate self, and in fact, they were talking about going out in public, but going out in public and being let alone. And there are implications for this as we build our computing and the computation spreads into all of the devices that we have. We're bringing that computation into our homes, into our workplaces, into our places of worship, into all of the educational settings where we care for the elderly. And we can ask this question too about the right to be let alone. I would also say as a part of that, fundamental to ourselves and our your attention is in some fundamental way your sense of self. And if our technologies are continually poking at ourselves, we actually are being deprived of our ability to experience ourselves. And this is a piece of what is meant, I think, by privacy. Privacy, as my colleagues here have also pointed out, as with any other human value, if you pick up privacy, you pick up a host of other values. So trust, a sense of agency, identity. We've heard respect. I would add dignity. So thinking about these as a constellation of values that are all implicated together. So that's one observation. A second observation I would like to make is a myth that these ideas about privacy and security and cybersecurity belong to the computer scientists among us, the information scientists among us. We're talking about metamaterials now, where in the very materials, the paint and the wall, and those of you who are material scientists are going to be embedding computation into your material science. If you're somebody who is doing biomechanics and you're thinking about building prosthesis, and there are going to be brain-machine implants that are going to help people control these prosthesis, and they're working wirelessly, well, all of these issues are a part fundamentally of what you are doing in your engineering practice. If you're an aerospace engineer, I was speaking with someone yesterday, they're talking about how much all of the computation is a part of what the aerospace engineering is doing. So in whatever your field of engineering is and your practice as an engineer, these issues are there. They're part and parcel now of what it means to do those kinds of engineering. Observation number 3. I would challenge us to engineer with a moral and a technical imagination. That our best practices need to consider, and I think this is just really good engineering practice, we need to look continually both for optimal solutions, but we have to consider also average case and especially worst case scenarios. But when we do that, we need not just to ask the technical questions, you know, will my bridge fall? Will my plane drop out of the sky? But we also need to ask the societal and ethical dimensions of those as well. You know, does my system treat all groups equitably? What are the worst case security risks? And these same kinds of practices we have for best case engineering and doing worst case analyses apply to these kinds of social and ethical implications as well. So take all of that good engineering practice that you know and begin to wrap in these other kinds of analyses into your research practice, your daily industry practice, how you're mentoring the next generation. The fourth observation I'd like to make is a challenge again to design and engineer with a longer term time frame. You know, in my field, information and computer science, we typically design in 3 weeks to 6 months. We deploy for 18 months. We call it obsolete in 5 years. And most of you are probably thinking about your cell phone, and if it's more than 5 years old, you're thinking about, oh, you know, I've got to toss that away. Well, you know, recall that all this information and computing is now integral to all these other physical materials. Think of the Internet of Things, these metamaterials, DNA, we're talking about biological computing. Think about the millions of devices, the billions of devices, the scale that my colleagues here have been putting on the table, and now think 20, 30, 50 years out. What will the population on the planet be if all of these people are generating all of this data in all of these data warehouses? Really, how does this scale? So what should we be doing now? If we think about those time scales, if we think about that kind of scale seriously, where do they go awry? Can we think about that now? And what steps should we take now to ensure that in 50 years, society is in a healthy, flourishing state? And we need to also ask, healthy and flourishing for whom, right? So that is a set of challenges, and it's a design practice that I think we're talking about, where we shift our time frame and take these scales into account. And I believe that that would fundamentally change the kinds of infrastructures we would build. It might change what kind of data we think about collecting, how we think about retention of that data, and so forth. And finally, the fifth observation I would make is that our moral capabilities lag behind our technological ones. I'd like to suggest that the power of our tools and technologies have far surpassed our moral capabilities to use them wisely. So, consider the scientific and technical advances over the past 200 years, since the early 1800s. You know, if you think about that, I would draw a very sharp exponential curve in terms of augmenting our physical strength, our speed, our ability to look small, travel into space, manipulate matter and energy. That's the exponential curve. Now, think about our ethical and moral development as individuals and as society over the same time period. I mean, as core fundamental human beings, we just haven't changed a lot in the last 200 years. So that line is more or less linear and more or less flat. So, right. And we are the people who have created that particular graph in that way. Our technical abilities, the things that we have built, can be used for good or harm, but they've grown at enormous scale. You know, we could feed the planet, we could destroy the planet with atomic bombs. People talk about the Anthropocene. And if we're honest, our wisdom for using these scientific and technical prowess has not grown apace. So if you agree with this general assessment of our current state, then I'd like to leave you with some really critical and I think very hard questions. How do we bring our tools and technologies and engineering practice into better alignment with our ethical and moral capabilities? What checks and balances should we engineer into our technologies? What, if anything, shouldn't we build, and why? And what social processes should we put in place for monitoring and holding ourselves as a society accountable for how our technologies are engineered and deployed? So I don't claim to have much insight into the answers to those questions, but I think asking those questions very explicitly is very important for us as we go forward.
What great framing. So thank you to all of you for your opening comments on this. If our ethical and moral capabilities have not kept up with our technological capabilities, let's just take that for a moment to be true. Your three companies have all at some point held the promise of creating a global community, making the world a smaller place, exchange of ideas, all of which were certainly presented or marketed, or maybe just as humans we assumed are good things, right? Making the world a smaller place is probably a better thing. Creating global communities is probably a better thing. When I started in this business, really only Microsoft was around, and you know, your types of companies, these companies that made technology accessible originally with Microsoft to workers and then to individuals, were thought to be a different type of company. They were thought to be different in their interests. In other words, suddenly the interests of your companies were broader than traditionally the interests of some companies that really served shareholders and were exclusively for profit. Here, things were being built that were bigger than the normal paradigm. To what degree today do you think that the issues we're discussing here, privacy and security, are in crisis? The headlines would suggest it's a crisis, that the horse is out of the barn. We put too much stuff out there. Too much stuff is available. It got sold. It got leaked. It got breached. You're in big trouble. Your life's on the internet, and we can't put that genie into the bottle. Mike, you mentioned earlier when we were talking that one of the things that happens in the media is that the failures loom large, and the successes, or the things that your companies have avoided, or we as a society have avoided, aren't spoken of. So give me your sense on a continuum of absolute disaster to not so bad. Where are we?
So when we were talking earlier, I talked about how it's hard to see holes in data, right? We see the dots, and I gave the famous World War II example of Abraham Wald looking at maps of bullet holes in airplanes for the Air Force. The Air Force had been counting all the bullet holes from the airplanes coming back to figure out where to put the armor. And he saw that there were no reports of bullet holes in the engines. It was just two big holes there, and he said, obviously you need to put all your armor on the engines. And that's because the airplanes that were shot in the engines were in the bottom of the ocean, and they weren't coming back for us to count the bullet holes. So it's sometimes hard to see those holes in the data. But there are some holes in the security data. You know, in the early 2000s, what we saw were a series of worms. These were self-reproducing viruses that exploited flaws and made copies of themselves, and they went through the internet in a matter of hours. And they caused tens of billions of dollars of damage. And the computer security community, not through any particular single innovation, no magic bullet, but actually through very careful engineering, software armoring, a whole series of advances, has largely kept, for now, those types of global catastrophic events from happening. They are often limited now to data silos or individual applications rather than self-reproducing global disaster. And another example I like to give is in just this limited case of phishing emails, this idea of getting an email that tricks you into giving up your secrets. We really are living in a world that is leaving the password behind. Google itself has taken the idea of a secret that you keep in your head that you can give to somebody else and turned it into a physical token that lives in your computer you can't give to someone else. And so at Google, everyone runs this hardware authentication and no one can give up their secret. And we have a hole in the data now. There are no phishing attacks at Google because there's nothing to convince anyone to give up. So we have these little victories. And I think as a security practitioner, if I could leave the crowd with anything, is that those victories come not through the fixing of an architectural flaw that should have been spotted from the beginning, but through reacting to overwhelming surprise from the cleverness of attackers and then careful engineering in stacks by dedicated teams of hundreds of people. It's very difficult to create those absences.
Anshul?
So I totally agree with Mike here that we don't celebrate our victories, especially in security and privacy space, because it is mostly considered that's the default. Like it should all be private and secure, and not celebrating those has created this imbalanced perspective that whenever we hear about a breach or a compromise, we're like, oh my God, everything is gloom and doom, as opposed to we should also look at what are the things, what are the advancements we have made over time. So if you think about early 2000s, when web applications were picking up, or maybe even late 90s, your cross-site request forgery, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, these are all web application attacks. They were like rampant everywhere. You can just load a website and steal somebody's cookies and you can be that person. Now, when you look at websites, by default, they take care of these things. Browsers have become much more secure. So when you think about the progress we have made over the years, we need to celebrate those. And I personally think we have made jobs of our attackers that much more harder. They have to be more creative now. They have to look at more venues. And not just because we are building these security functions in there, we are, as a community also, we are coming together. Users are much smarter. They know how to secure their accounts with all the features they have been provided. We as security community are coming closer together. So I think it is not totally like, oh, we don't know anything and we don't know where we are heading.
I mean, I don't celebrate on a daily basis that my home and car haven't been broken into, but I guess that's one way to look at it.
Well, there are clearly places that we still need to improve. So while the Google employees don't get phished anymore, and by the way, if you don't have a security key, you should really get one. They are amazing. There are lots and lots of passwords that people are still using, and the usability of passwords is pretty terrible. And so people still get phished. So we've been playing around with a lot of things. So there's a team at Google called Safe Browsing, and they took a copy of the internet and they stuck it in a machine learning model, and it will, you can see this in Chrome now, it will go and try and tell you, hey, we think you're trying to put your password into something that's trying to phish you. Now, we'd already been scanning the entire internet for these phishing attacks, and we publish a feed of this so you can get warnings in all sorts of applications and all sorts of browsers, but we're moving on to do this faster because it turns out that these phishing attacks, people will put them up and use them like 30 seconds later, which is faster than we can scan the entire internet. I know we have a lot of computers, but I swear it's faster than we can scan the entire internet. So moving on to things like, hey, how can we use ML in there? How can we make it so that we don't have these problems anymore, these new problems that we're seeing is really important.
The degree to which when the internet went from a remarkable business tool or a remarkable tool for science and the military and engineering to a tool for individuals through, in many cases, search, well, portals and then search and then social media, we started, Batya, to think about an exchange. And maybe it wasn't as explicit as it should have been, but to some degree, to your discussion of what privacy is, we did agree to give some things up because we didn't think the intrusions were so important. So initially for advertising, really, you used a free internet, you got free email services and free all sorts of things because someone was getting some information about you and using it to monetize it. And that didn't seem like that serious an issue, or some people might have thought it was a good trade-off. I don't think in the beginning we thought the trade-off would be somehow maybe one day getting my information to use for purposes that I didn't explicitly sign off on one end, or the other end, somebody getting my information inappropriately or maliciously. How much of this is on us as internet users? Because we're all tied to it now. We can't go off the grid. So to what degree does the consumer's understanding of privacy or security and its problems lie with the consumer?
Well, I guess I'm going to challenge some of the things that you said. I think you can go back to papers, my memory might be a little flaky, but let's say 1985, for example, that looks at cases where data, this is actually utility data, was used by the utility companies for something other than billing. It was collected for billing purposes, and it was used for setting prices, right? And at that point, that's a juncture where this question of if we collect information for one reason, can the person who has then collected that information arbitrarily decide to use that information in some other way, right? And I believe in some of those early court cases, the decision was no, you can't, right? So there are certain sorts of expectations. And privacy is particularly interesting because what constitutes a privacy violation depends upon social expectation. So if in a given society, the expectation is that whatever data, if you ask me for some data and I give you some data, or even implicitly I agree to give you data for a purpose, in other words, I decide to buy something, so I give you my information so that you can bill me. I've implicitly engaged in that transaction. I've given you that information for that purpose. If my expectation is that it's for that purpose and only that purpose, then if it is used for some other purpose, I think that would be viewed as a privacy violation, right? So now the question is, over time, because of the business models that have been put in place, have people been moved to a different set of expectations? But then I want to complicate it further, because if the way in which you get goods and services is primarily through one means, then in some sense, people in the society don't really have choice. So here's a great example. If you want to apply to a university right now, and you don't want to use cookies, you don't want to give up information through cookies, you're in a real bind, because virtually no university will accept an undergraduate education that isn't submitted through some kind of online form, and those are all using cookies, right? And so what that means is that if we don't design other kinds of alternatives, we are actually coercing the public into certain kinds of behaviors. And so it's those ways in which, when these business models, if you ask how different are the business models, well, they're all virtually very similar. And if those are the ways in which I get goods and services and can participate in the society, and I don't have viable alternatives, then maybe I don't really have the choice that you were saying that I had.
This is an interesting reframing of the question, and that might, I guess, my comment that we can't get off the grid is that it's the conversation about the evolution of what I use my digital world for, and whether or not I actually have choice in these issues. So some of what, Anshul, that you have emphasized is choice that people do have. But ultimately, how do you regard the evolution of how people use your product? Security at Facebook is a very different thing than security at NBC, right? Security at NBC is not part of our product offering. It's ancillary to what we do. But security at Facebook is implicit. It's implicit in what people are transacting with you for?
Actually, I do want to say, you just said that security is not part of your offering. I would disregard.
I understand. I guess what I mean is that it's something that has to happen to support our main activity.
Correct. You
Right.
still need to have secure
Yes.
systems because as
Yes,
you
sure.
are publishing news, you
Absolutely,
really don't
right.
want somebody to come in
Sure.
and change the content
Understood.
of your news.
Right. No, that's true. I guess in a different way, though, it's so much more central to all of your planning and development.
So, in my mind, security should be central to everybody's planning and development, especially if they are helping any end users, they have their data, because you really cannot do your work in this day and age unless you secure what you are carrying. And when it comes to securing people's data, it is of utmost importance that you let them know what are their rights on your platform, like how you are going to use their data. Be very upfront, be very transparent about it. And once you have shared that, follow that, and also give them choice so that they can opt out. If they don't feel comfortable with it, they can always opt out. So one good example that I have here is of advertising on our platform. We get asked this a lot, why am I seeing this ad? Where did you get this information about me? And so you can go to your Facebook page and you can see all the data we have about you. And you can also delete whatever you feel uncomfortable about. You can also go to ads preferences section and you can say, sorry, I don't want to be ad targeted, which means you will still continue to see ads, they just won't be targeted to your profile. Which, like, if you really like XYZ things, you will not see ads for those things. You will see ads for ABC, which might annoy you even further, probably. Because now you're like, why am I seeing this ad? So it's a lot about what our users are expecting, how we are setting those expectations, and how we are making sure that they have a choice on your platform. So, and then you overlay security on top of it to make sure that whatever expectations you have set with your users, you are actually following through on those expectations.
So, Leah, the criticism is that all of those things that Anshul just described were not as explicit as they could have been. And maybe people didn't insist that they were, certainly in the early days of using social media or search or anything else. But that, in fact, it was sort of more profitable for people not to figure out how to opt out of ads or not to give as much information or not to have things targeted at them. And I think that's sort of the prevailing criticism that a lot of people have right now of these companies, that it wasn't all that clear that this is how this was all going to go down. And now you've got a lot of information on me and maybe I can't do anything about that. How do you think about that?
So wait, back up.
Yeah.
One. I want to point out that journalists are actually considered some of the most difficult people to secure. When we're designing security systems,
Right.
Journalists are actually in the category we design for as high-risk users.
Why is that?
Because you have all sorts of really interesting sources, and you end up with a bunch of very powerful organizations who are very angry at you for some reason.
Interesting.
So,
Good points. Right. So we've got extra sensitive stuff to protect and extra people who are trying to get into our stuff.
yeah, and just like a huge number of people who do very important work,
Right.
you speak technology necessarily as
Right.
a first language. And so we have these people who are very, very busy and have very sensitive things, and they need to be protected really, really
Right.
strongly. So
I appreciate that you think that way.
There are a bunch of people who focus exclusively on securing journalists and human
Right.
rights workers. You tend to be in the same bucket there.
Yeah, and hacktivists too. Like, they are the ones who are, like, you
Sure.
are at the forefront and you are literally putting your life out there.
No, and I buy into what Mike said, that it is our job to discuss the failings and the weaknesses and to hold people to account, and that I would love to live in a world where we can talk more about the successes you've had. So I'm not wishing to suggest absolute irresponsibility on the part of these companies. I guess the point is
That's
the
good, thank you.
underscoring of the ways in which people could not share as much about themselves was not a goal, right?
No, it is. So if you, do you know about, say, Google Takeout?
No.
So Google Takeout is a thing that we built 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, I think. So it was somewhere around there. And you can go and download the information that you've asked us to store. So you can download all your email and your photos and all of your stuff. And you can go and delete that. So we built that a really long time ago. We've had these deletion things, and we had to develop novel systems engineering techniques in order to be able to delete data from global scale systems reliably, which turns out to be really, really, really hard. Especially with the squirrels around. Squirrels will take out your system like I cannot even explain.
Like real squirrels.
Real squirrels, like the things with the fluffy tails. Both Yahoo and Level 3 have cited squirrels as being the cause of some of their very biggest outages. Google had to build special anti-shark technology on our cables. Animals, they are going to mess up your day and their own. But we spent a lot of time building this stuff. It's been there for a long time. But one of the things that I've tried to do, I used to work on Google Plus on their security and privacy. And one of the things that we tried to do in there is if there's something that's surprising, that could be surprising, and it's very hard to predict what's going to be surprising for any given person. For example, some people are going to be super excited that you just suggested a chicken recipe to them, and there are going to be some people who are very deeply offended by that. And it's very, very hard to predict because humans have all of the diversity and the beauty of the entire world. And so in a place that you might see something that might be surprising, like we do our best to make sure that that never ever happens, but if there's something that we couldn't predict, I want you to be able to poke at it and go to a place where you can say, how do I make this stop? So both that design up front and kind of those recovery places if something isn't going like you want.
So Batya, that's interesting. To what degree do these issues about privacy more than security get resolved with the greater empowerment of the user?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I want to follow up on what Leah is saying. Is that I think strategically, from an engineering point of view, we want to be building, and also what Micah said. It's really important what we build at the low level. What we build in those lower level architectures is going to tell us up here at the interaction models what's going to be easy to do, what's going to be difficult to do but doable, and what's going to be impossible to do, right? And we also need to be able to build fundamentally at this lower level some easy hooks so that when you're up here and there's something you want to achieve, you can actually reach down into that architecture and facilitate those things. And the other thing we know is that as these technologies unfold in society, they will be appropriated in ways that we can't anticipate. So we can do lots of envisioning up front. We can anticipate different kinds of harms or biases that might unfold, and we can be on the front end of thinking about those things. But also, the good engineering means that we are fundamentally building architectures that, as they unfold and are appropriated in society, we can easily reach into and make those adaptations. And that's what I mean by good or better engineering design that's responsive to the context in which we're actually building things in. From the interaction point of view, I mean, there are many different ways to approach things, but from my own personal perspective, I really I feel I succeeded in a design myself when through the very interaction of the thing that I want to do, I construct a mental model that allows me to just use that technology in the way that has the results for how I want my data to flow or not flow or be shared. And I don't have to go through any kind of explicit intervention. Because if you think about it, for any of these things, the reason I'm coming to the technology is to do something else. You know, I want to apply to the university. I want to communicate with my grandkids or my grandparents, or I want to do a business transaction. I really don't want to think about privacy, and I don't want to think about security, but I want to know how to make good choices. And so if the interaction models themselves help me construct a view, a mental model about how to just interact with the system so that I make those choices, that's really good interaction design. And that's where I think we should be, you know, that's sort of our gold standard. It's very hard to achieve, but that is the gold standard.
Okay, so one issue here is interactive design and the engineering around that. The other I want to touch on, Mike, is that when we talk about things being appropriated in ways that were not intended, I want to think about bad actors and where that evolution is. Part of the problem we have is there are individual bad actors. There are, and you've all discussed ways in which you have developed technology to mitigate some of that. But obviously, one of the big discussions we are having now about election interference or whatever the case is large, sophisticated non-state actors or state-supported actors. And in Alex Gibney's documentary Zero Day, you know, one of the things that's brought up is that in a nuclear world, governments engage in this activity, so treaties can be engaged into between governments to inspect particular sites where nuclear devices are being built. In this world of either non-state actors that are very sophisticated or supported by states, are your consortiums of threat detection and engineering around it enough? Who has to be involved in this in order to protect us from really big things that are not somebody grabbing my email for some small but nefarious purpose?
Well, what you're speaking to is the fact that around computer security there are multiple conversations. So a year ago I worked for DARPA, for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And DARPA and its associated advisory boards like to talk about a threat pyramid, right? So at the base, very numerous but low skilled. And as you go higher, there are less actors but more skill. And so the tip of that pyramid are the nation states and their equivalents. And a lot of the work that we do as computer security professionals has to do with taking that pyramid and drowning it in as much water as possible, right? So when you raise the bar, you cut off the bottom of the pyramid, the very numerous low resource actors. And a lot of great engineering work is being done. What that is that's an economic argument. It is becoming more costly to attack, which lowers the number of individuals who can engage in it. And you'll see this divide in the computer security community over cyber hygiene, which is this idea that a good user who makes good choices is going to be safe, and that it's often a bad choice that leads to an unsafe outcome. I clicked on the phishing email, the attacker leveraged a flaw that should have been patched in my system is compromised. There are other folks in the security community, Bruce Schneier being one of the notable voices, who says that it's just never the user's fault. There shouldn't be such a thing as cyber hygiene. We should just only have good choices available to us. The button on the computer that says, compromise this computer should never be, you shouldn't be able to draw it. And that sounds like a very simple mandate, but it's incredibly difficult. I think thousands of people in security engineering teams across the country are trying to work to eliminate that button. And that hardware token I talked about before, which likely says you should get one, is part of that engineering. But there is this other conversation at the top of the pyramid, right? And let's leave behind Hollywood hacking and everything you've ever seen in a movie about how hacking is something that where it's very accessible and intuitive. We're guessing passwords. We've pulled the Post-it note off the back of the computer and it's ABC123. We're not talking about that. We're talking about sophisticated tools that have been developed by professionals that are like digital lockpicks that can break into a system with no known vulnerabilities, where everything has been done right. And that moment where an alert pops up on the Apollo 11 panel, right? The Chernobyl panel does not exist. There's no alert, there's no failure, there's nothing wrong. It's just an adversary is in the system. I think the comforting thing that I would like people to take away about that other threat model of highly advanced actors who can defeat the entire system in depth is that that pyramid is very small. So the idea that anonymity will continue at the tip kind of flies in the face of the idea that we're only going to have a few actors with that kind of capability, especially as the water level rises. So at Microsoft, Brad Smith, our chief legal officer, is one of the many voices in the technology sector that says that the technology sector, which does global business, is a digital Switzerland. It is an independent and neutral entity in these contests, and that it is the job of the international legal community to come to an agreement about nation-state forces involved in the internet.
How, let me just go through and get your views on this, Anshul, as well. Because this is, you know, if I can sit here and think, well, with a little bit of time with you guys, I can figure out my user hygiene in a way that protects me as much as possible. But to what degree am I worrying about the wrong thing? And should I be worried about bigger issues? Not just hacking my system as a journalist, but systems that are important to us to function safely as society.
As Mike pointed out, things are definitely different than what they were decades ago. We are not as much worried about the lowest of the pyramid, which is the script kiddies and anybody who can get their hands on your systems. But at the same time, the way things are progressing with, say, Internet of Things devices, people are thinking that, oh, this is just a plug point I'm selling over Christmas, which you can connect to your Wi-Fi, and then through your phone, you can turn on and off your Christmas lights without getting out in the cold. Really useful. But at the same time, now it is talking to your Wi-Fi on the same network. And how many people will create separate VLANs? Not many. So now this simple plug has access to your entire network data flow that's happening. And if you are expecting these end users to think through these things as they buy the simple plug to turn on and off their Christmas lights, that's a wrong expectation. We really need to get in forefront of this, and we need to make sure that these devices are protected by design. Last year, I think we all saw this attack, the DDoS attack, where it was because some ethereal tooling of NSA leaked that used some of the baby monitors and Internet of Things devices to have this major DDoS attack. Now, those are things which are not going to go away in any short term, because we are building, like our attackers are building stronger attacking tools, and they will leak. So what is important for us is to patch these systems. So when you are building anything, make sure you are able to patch those devices right away, even without users' intervention. Because users should not have to worry about these things. As you said, like, how much should I worry about will I get hacked, rather than going about your day-to-day and doing your daily business? You should not have to worry about it. It should be just done for you under the covers. I think we as security industry are not there yet. We have a long way to go. We have to definitely mature our systems where we are not laying this burden on our users, and we can do it for them transparently.
I agree with what both of you said, and I'd also point out that because nation-state actors and because those incredibly powerful attackers are part of our landscape, it has been really helpful to us to have the kind of scale that we have, right? When I talk about the phishing attacks, which nation-state actors totally use, by the way, they use very targeted phishing attacks called spear phishing attacks. So if you look at some of the election interference from last year, you can see them using those. It really helped us to be able to take the entire internet and put it in a machine learning model. And so it's one of those things where you need to build that substrate, to build all of those layers in a way that's really strong, to have enough data in order to be able to detect these incredibly subtle signals that they send, because they'll tiptoe their way in, or they'll try, and they won't set off a giant alarm, but there will be some little traces that you need to be able to find. And you need a lot of skill, and you need a lot of data in order to be able to do that.
Batya, this is interesting because the conversation's evolved into one in which I was worried about my internet security, then I was worried about plug-in devices in my home, and now I'm worried about stuff that I can have no control over anyway. What in the world, and I'm keeping this away from my colleagues here on the panel who are working with corporations that are in the midst of this conversation nationally, sometimes with Congress, the issue of regulation then becomes an interesting one. There are people who tweet me when we cover these things to say the government's got to get in front of this thing and properly regulate it. There are others who say the government's not smart enough to understand what is going on here. And there are yet others who say we need to dedicate more of our resources, whether it's these companies' resources or our scientific community or engineering community resources, to figuring out the most sophisticated of the attackers who would be wanting to do bad things to us. In your mind, what's the thinking collectively that needs to go into solving this problem so that in 10, 20, 30, 50 years, we still live in, or we're still moving forward on our trajectory in this remarkably convenient digital world, but in ways that are not making us feel less safe than we do today?
Well, challenging question, right? I'll just tell you what my intuitions are, because that's probably the best that I can do. I would say to my colleagues in their companies that I feel, by and large, they're pursuing a single sort of solution with a single sort of business model. And I think that that's dangerous. It's dangerous in the sense that in any kind of ecosystem, if you have a greater diversity, then you pursue a greater range of ideas, you see greater ranges and possibilities of solutions, and different kinds of choices that we can make in different kinds of ways. So from a systemic point of view, what I would say is that the corporations are too powerful in owning the territory of the solutions that are being explored. And so that may mean that we do need more of public sector exploration and different kinds of solutions, and coming out of the scientific community. It's a different kind of role for regulation to play. In other words, it's not so much to shut down innovation per se, but is there a way in which regulation could work to diversify, to require companies to pursue multiple kinds of paths? For example, just take the whole advertising business model that's taken over. There are many other kinds of business models, and those business models would not need to have as much information or data from people in order for those business models to succeed. So in some ways, what we're experiencing with respect to the sense of everybody's activities and transactions being sort of observed, recorded, and shuffled off to servers and then analyzed is really a fallout of the kinds of business models that are being set up here. And that's a choice. Corporations could make different choices. The public doesn't have an opportunity right now to go to companies that are offering different kinds of choices. And that's a different way to think about what kind of regulation. Again, for me, I think a monopoly kind of view around the structure of the technical solutions is the kind of mindset that I'm thinking about. Another thing that I think about is the development of nuclear energy in this country. When I was first studying engineering and hanging out with the people who were studying nuclear engineering, they're just figuring out how to build, nuclear power plants. And, I remember asking my classmates, well, what are you going to do with all the waste? And what my classmates said is, well, by the time we've generated that waste in 10 years, we'll have figured it out. Okay, well, it's been more than 10 years. But I think that there's a really important lesson for us in terms of, as scientists, as engineers, and in terms of setting policy and how we do our engineering work, which is, when are we putting in place a set of problems for which we do not yet now have technical or engineering solutions or good ideas for technical or engineering solutions, but that actually in 10 years would put society at risk? And is these large collections of data that are sitting on servers, and I do want to mention the fact that digital data is very fragile data. The lifetime of these servers and protecting those bits from bit rots is something like, 5 years if you really want to make sure, 10 years at an offset. That's a heck of a lot of data that we are running the infrastructure of our society on. If somebody told you that you put everything that was the infrastructure of your society on material that was going to decay within 5 to 10 years, and you couldn't completely secure that, if they gave you that scenario, would you sit there and shake your head and say, what kind of country, what kind of scientific infrastructure would do such a thing? And yet that characterization is not so far from where we are. So I think it's important to frame the questions and the state of the art in these ways, and to look historically at other examples that we can learn from, and ask these really hard questions. I think that when we, in some ways, we get lost in what might be my next new technical fix or strategy, it obscures or distracts from what I think really are the critical level of question that we need to be asking.
So yeah, I appreciate that very fulsome answer, and it leads to a lot more questions, Mike. I will realize that maybe I was inarticulate in using regulation interchangeably with government involvement. You did work. No, I think you answered the right question. I think I didn't ask it as well as I should have, because I realized Mike has spent time with DARPA, and you've all obviously had involvement with government. I think there's a way. Can there be a greater role for government or governments to play in dealing with the top of the pyramid type dangers? Maybe it's regulation, maybe it's not regulation, maybe it's a resource issue. I don't think as an American citizen, I have a clear understanding of either these issues about the equivalent of nuclear waste in our digital space, the deterioration of the infrastructure, or the protection against very powerful forces. I don't think it's clear to me who's in charge of keeping me safe and or identifying and fixing this problem. Who is and who should it be?
Who should be in charge of safety on the internet? I think that that leadership is often claimed rather than appointed. I don't think, and just speaking for the United States, I don't think that right now we have a climate where anyone wants the government to be put in charge of that. Certainly, the call for a digital Geneva Convention from Microsoft's chief legal officer, you can do a search for Brad Smith, Digital Geneva Convention, read his thoughts about that. But in terms of the fragility, right, which implies kind of a potential catastrophe event of that massive data collection that we're building, that global data collection, how to keep it, how to make safe uses of it, and then how to keep it safe, both those questions. I think that having worked for an agency whose job it is to build advanced technologies and then transition them, it's important for people to understand how incredibly difficult it is to go from research technologies that could solve these problems to products that can solve these problems. I'll give one applied example. We've talked about the ability to to operate on encrypted data. This is a new field called homomorphic encryption. If you talk to a security and privacy technologist, they'll tell you about the miracle of homomorphic encryption, which is that you take data, like my name, you encrypt it so you have ciphertext no one can read, and then you do computation on that name while it's encrypted, which sounds impossible, but I assure you that this is possible. It is just incredibly computationally expensive. But while I was at DARPA, we saw kind of an incredible demo. It was a telephone call that took place between commercially available cell phones where it was a conference call. So six calls had to be mixed with echo cancellation over an anonymous mix net, so you couldn't tell who was calling in from where, using encrypted voice streams so that if you were at the server, you couldn't decrypt and listen to any of the voice. And the echo cancellation and voice mixing was done via partially homomorphic encryption. So the voicemail server, whose job it was to mix the streams, was mixing encrypted data without having any access to the conversation. And you see that demo, and you say, this is the future. This is incredible, right? We're going to be able to have cloud-based technologies where we can have voice telephony, voice video, and the cloud companies can lock themselves out of the data so there can't be a breach. That's exactly what we want. But the incredible long march between the technologists say it's possible and we can build a global cloud product with that technology inside, I can't overstate how long that takes. It can be decades. And I don't know that you said these companies were architected without those choices in mind. I think that in every company there were security, privacy technologists who wanted to do those things and who put those options on the table. And it has often been engineering constraints, the tyranny of the possible and the tyranny of the now, that have selected the model we have that works. And we are trying to get the technology transition done to get those future technologies in place that are going to protect against these things. In terms of existential threats to data, I can talk about two technologies we're building in my lab. We have now our second generation underwater data center. This is a data center that, we look at Moore's law, the constant progress of chips getting faster, which seems to be stopping. And we think that maybe computers are going to last longer, maybe 20 years. So the economics of building a data center that lives under the water, that's cooled by the ocean, powered by the ocean, and lasts 2 decades, is viable enough to now have our second generation prototype. And there's a live fish cam on our underwater data center. Take a look into the ocean north of Scotland from your phone. And we're looking at longer term storage, like DNA-based storage. But I don't want to underplay the concern. The reason that research is underway is because people are concerned. And I think that the question is going to be, can we get those technologies out of prototype, out of research, and into core internet fabric before something terrible happens? Right? It really does always feel like a race.
All right, so that's all the smart questions I have. Which means that I'm going to hand it over to you people, but I think this would be a perfect time for us to take a quick break, try and keep it to 15 minutes, and let's get right back here at 11:20 and then line up at the mics because I'll start to take your questions. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.